I'm here with Brian Falk. Brian, it's really nice to meet with you. I've been reading your new book, Circling the Drain, George Carlin and James Hillman on Culture and Language,
Yeah.
published through Spring, which
hmm
is Hillman's old publishing house that he passed on. I think before he passed on, I think he had already passed it on to other people to
That's
steward,
right.
right?
Yeah,
But it's amazing that it's still going and publishing his collected works and a bunch of other new authors like yourself. So it's really cool to see people adding to that kind of archetypal psychology corpus.
it is. Yes.
Um, Maybe we could start just by getting a little bit of your background,
Mhm.
how you came to depth psychology and how you got interested in Hillman. Uh, yeah, let's just start there.
Sure. The irony in a way is that I studied psychology in my undergraduate at the University of Santa Barbara and got a BA in psychology, but I hated it. And I was uninspired. I was dry. It was statistics. It was um, very distant, unemotional. And I didn't want anything to do with it. I was very disappointed. I ended up getting myself into Chinese medicine, but many years later, I went back to school and found depth psychology, and I had not read anything of Jung or Freud or much else in the field, but I wanted to get a PhD to teach and write, and I found depth psychology, and that's where I first got introduced to Hillman. I had never heard of Hillman. On my opening day walking through the campus, the admissions director asked if I knew Hillman, and I said no. And she looked at me and she says, "You will."
Wait a
And
minute.
yeah,
This is remarkable because most people I talk to who have gone to Pacifica go because it's the one place that's kind of founded on the teachings of Hillman. And of course, other people like Joseph Campbell are in there as well.
right.
But I'm imagining that you're in Santa Barbara, you want to get a PhD in psychology, and Pacifica is in just outside of Santa Barbara, right?
Yeah.
So was it by happenstance that you kind of stumbled into this Hillmanian world?
Not just that, it was happenstance that I stumbled into psychology at all and Pacifica at all. I grew up in the area and never heard of Pacifica. So let's start with that. And, I lived 15 minutes from the campus, never heard of it, never went to an event, never saw anything advertised, didn't meet anybody. They were up in the mountains doing their thing. And I thought, how could this be such a beautiful campus, two campuses, beautiful, and this rich program? And yet here I am in Carpinteria. I was living there at the time and never heard of Pacifica. Um, what ended up happening was I thought, okay, what Chinese medical doctor acupuncturist has gone further and got a PhD? And if so, what? And there weren't many. I just did an online search. There was one PhD program for Chinese medicine in New York, but it was not accredited. Didn't want to do that. Um, I found a couple people with literature backgrounds, but there was one person that struck my attention, and she was an acupuncturist living in Idaho and had graduated from a school called Pacifica with a PhD in depth psychology. So I contacted her and she told me about the program. As it turns out, she was one of the co-founders of the new track, the Somatic Emphasis program, and she was going to be moving to Carpinteria in a few months to be the co-chair of the program. And she said, if you're into the body, you're doing body work and acupuncture, she's like, there's other programs at Pacifica, but just do the somatics program. It's that integration of body, psyche, and you're gonna love it. And that was enough for me to be like, okay, I'm gonna go check out the campus. And um, once I got up there, I was like, oh, this is. I looked at the curriculum, shamanism, alchemy, dance movement therapy, all kinds of interesting stuff, and I was like,
Yeah.
I'm done. So it was like I had no idea I was going to do psychology again after all those years, and certainly depth psychology and somatic studies, which I didn't even know somatic studies was. And then having that be in my backyard, it was like, oh, I'm
Oh
meant to
man.
go here.
Um, who's the teacher that you're referencing? Can we give her a shout out?
Of course, her name is Callie or Callan Hutar. She's now up in Washington, I believe, Bellingham, Washington. Callie or Caitlin Hutar. So I owe a lot to her because she kind of talked me into it, and she was my advisor for the first year and a half at Pacifica, and fellow acupuncturist, and so I do owe a lot to her just to help me get into the school.
Hmm. And that's great. She's just across the water and border from where we are.
That's right.
Um,
That's right.
yeah, I'll look her up too. Now, the other thing I find really curious is that you got a BA in psychology and you never encountered or read Jung or Freud. Like Jung, I can kind of understand with a lot of programs, but even Freud, really?
He was a footnote to what? To a reductionist sexuality, this old person that kind of was a founder, but we've moved way beyond him. It
Right.
was he
This
was a
like
he was a
this
crazy
primitive
sex
idea
obsessed
that,
footnote.
right, right. Yeah. So it was mostly like behavioral stuff like Skinner and
Yep.
that's
Yep.
it.
Yeah. I essentially learned how to pick apart research studies, and learn little things like if there's an emergency and there's 200 people, you're less likely to get help when there's a lot of people versus if there's just one person around. I mean, little tidbits of kind of social psychology, statistics, and weird classes too. They had like like animal behavior. I had a class on like bees. I mean, it was distant from any what I would consider relevant. I mean, I wanted to study about myself and other people, like what makes us tick, what
Hmm.
gets us going as humans, and couldn't have been further away. And
Yeah.
like Hillman said, if you want to study psychology, you could do no worse than to go to a university psychology program. So
And that's why I've never done it. I mean,
yeah,
I've gotten really close. I've gotten accepted into like the local university here in Victoria. Because I'm like, I got to get the credentials, right? If people are going to take me seriously, and then also
yeah,
to partake in the system of insurance rebates and all that stuff,
right.
I gotta do the thing. And just looking at that opening syllabus of like statistics, and I'm like, I can't do it. My soul will not allow me to
It's
get a
soul
degree in
crushing. It's really soul
psychology.
crushing. It really is. It's bad.
So I've thought about ways like that I could creatively bypass it. Like, well, I'll get my BA in musicology, something I'm really passionate about, and
Exactly.
then I can go for the MA at Pacifica.
Yep. Exactly. Yep. I think unconsciously that's what I was doing.
Hmm.
I just,
Because you got
yeah.
an MA in traditional Chinese medicine, right?
Yes.
I didn't even know that you could get like an official MA master's in Chinese medicine.
Yeah, the now it's quite a oh gosh, it's gotten even more bizarre. Depending on the school and the program and the different titles that are now offered, it's become quite a confusing amalgam of degrees. Essentially, I went through medical school, and it by the end of that, you're trained as a doctor. You can diagnose and treat. We took a lot of Western medical classes as well. It should have been right from the get-go, Chinese medical doctor, CMD, in my opinion. As it was, we got a 4 year master's degree, which master's degrees shouldn't take 4 years, and at least in California, an LAC, which is licensed acupuncturist. Every state's a little bit different, but now you can do a DAOM program, Doctor of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine. It's an extra year of study, so you can officially have the title doctor. Um, you can get what's called a Doctor of Acupuncture, which is a shorter program. Doesn't encompass quite as much, but you can still have the title doctor.
Hmm.
So they've added other names to what essentially is a medical degree, and you in the process of doing that now you obtain a master's degree, but it is now it's 4 to 5 years, a lot of hours, almost as much as a naturopathic doctor, and a little less than an MD as far as time spent in the clinic and so forth. So it's a full program, but
Hmm.
they're still giving away master's degree. And if you want the title doctor, you pay an extra. 7 or 10 grand and you get a title of doctor. And I've asked my colleagues, did you learn anything else by doing that extra year? Nope.
Nope.
Just another 10 grand to get the title doctor. And I
Yeah.
bypassed that and just, it's ridiculous. You
Yeah.
know, so
Hmm. And what got you interested in Chinese medicine in the first place? You don't look like you're of Chinese descent to me. I could be
not
wrong,
that I'm aware of.
but there's,
In
yeah. Well, this is the interesting,
in an
maybe not.
ancestral lineage, I feel very, very at home. I wonder about that sometimes.
Hmm.
Um, The interesting thing is I didn't have any kind of healing experience, like wounded healer. I didn't have an injury or an illness that brought me to acupuncture or herbs, anything like that. My father was interested in herbology. He was taking tinctures, but it didn't catch on to me at all. I don't have anyone in my family who was in medicine. However, when I look backwards, the seed was probably planted when I was 8 or 9 years old, as far as wanting to be a doctor. I just didn't know what kind. And I spent my last year at the university doing volunteering and internships, trying to find a direction in the medical field. And it was sort of a neti neti, not this, not that, you know, looking at nursing, physical therapy, radiology, anything. And nothing was doing it for me. And then I got lucky. I had two different people in a short period of time tell me about Chinese medical school. There was a school in Santa Barbara at the time. One of them gave me a book. Another one suggested I go to the school. I went to the school and had a half an hour conversations with the admissions director. And she started telling me about the philosophy of the medicine and about the profession. And it was like, yes, that's what I'm looking for.
Hmm.
It was on a lot of levels what I really needed. It was something I could do for many years. I could continue studying as long as I was able to. It was rooted in nature, using my hands. Simple acupuncture needles and massage can help a lot just with that. Food is medicine. So it were really, and I had never had acupuncture before, but I was like, that's what I was looking for. So sort of by sometimes I think it maybe found me,
Hmm.
but if Ayurvedic medicine had been licensed, I might have gotten into that first because I'd started studying yoga and Ayurvedic medicine, but there's no licensure program in the US. So I knew I wanted a license
Hmm.
for a career. And that's how I was able to get my practice going was with Chinese medicine. And I couldn't have been more lucky and happier with my choice because it's been wonderful.
Hmm. Now the Hillmanian question would be, like you mentioned at 8 or 9, it was clear that, there was this inclination to be a doctor of some kind.
Yeah.
But reading your life backwards, was there anything in those early experiences that suggested an alternative, more naturalistic, elemental kind of approach?
Perhaps even as a young kid, I had an inclination towards walking my own beat. I didn't follow the typical paths as other kids did. If all the kids were going left, I was going right, kind of thing. Um, I remember being in the hospital and like stealing doctor gloves and like tongue depressors and things like that. I just had kind of a lot of images of helping people and being in a clinical setting. I used to love getting splinters out of myself or my sister or my mom, like doing
Ah,
little things with my hands.
yeah.
If my eyes
But
were better, or I found Western medicine to be different, I might have gotten into surgery. But I just liked using my hands. I liked helping people, and as a kid, those little tasks were always very attractive to me. And then when I was maybe 12 or 13, when I was in the Boy Scouts, we went down to Northridge, Los Angeles after the earthquake in 1995, I believe, and we helped people move out of their apartments that were completely destroyed. And I had a very strong hit of helping people where I wasn't getting anything directly back. There was nothing about me in it. It was going there helping other people, and it felt really good, And those kinds of things stick with one, and I look back on that as being kind of a pivotal time too. And just thinking, I don't know what I'm gonna do, but I wanna help people in some way, and then using my hands and my brain was also very attractive. So, um,
Hmm.
or yeah, those images I
Yeah.
think were from
Yeah,
early
looking
on.
for those inklings of the acorn showing itself early on. Like,
Right.
what I'm noticing is the attraction to the implements of doctoring or healing, like the tongue
Mm-hmm.
depressor,
Yeah.
and then mentioning the removing of splinters. Is kind of a reverse acupuncture in a way, like taking the needle
Didn't
out.
think about that. Good observation.
And
Yeah.
the way I've always taken splinters out is actually like with a needle,
Mm. Yeah.
kind of poke
Getting in
around in
there.
there, lift it
Uh-huh.
up, and yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Curious.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is the thing that I think about a lot, and what I consider actually to be like the best evidence for soul is like,
Mm,
why does a guy like you, a guy, I think seemingly of European descent, living in
mhm,
Carpinteria, California, why this attraction to this ancient Chinese medical system? And
mhm,
like for me, why an interest in yoga early on?
mhm,
I didn't grow up in a spiritual family. I got into yoga before yoga was a big thing.
mm,
But there was this attraction and attraction to the Hindu deities and the kind of
mhm,
flavors and colors of Hinduism.
mhm,
Uh, there's nothing in my early history to point me in that
mhm,
direction, no exposure
mhm.
or anything, just an
Yeah.
innate kind of attraction and resonance with this thing, seemingly so foreign. And I get the same sense with you that it's
Yeah.
like kind of inexplicable other than reincarnation, past life, spiritual lineage.
Yeah. It's an interesting pondering. I think those are all possibilities, and I also suspect that um my criticism of my own culture, or at least my uh interest elsewhere. I love traveling, and there's always been a sense of there's so much more out there than my little beach bubble that I grew up in. And um, I found people interesting. I found different languages fascinating, and a sense of kind of a criticalness of my own culture, which perhaps
Hmm.
pushes or propels one elsewhere. Um,
Right. Or at least a dissatisfaction,
at least a
right?
dissatisfaction, yeah.
Yeah.
And but I think there's also a curiosity too of life in general, just something different, breaking out of the norm of what's the status quo or what's expected, what the that everyone else is doing. Again, all the kids going one way, I want to go another way. If everyone's
Hmm.
studying s- sports, I want to go read something else.
Hmm.
It's that, yeah, a sense of difference.
Well, and there's also that the curiosity that's there from the beginning, like with you and with me too. Like, what makes
Hmm.
us tick? And for
Hmm.
me, it was like trying to understand some of the chaos, I think, in my life.
Yeah.
Like, why do people act like this? And what's this
Yeah.
all about?
Yeah.
Also reading early on, so kind of getting into other people's experience and
Mhm.
getting a sense of the variety of experience with people.
Yes. Yeah.
And so with this question of like what makes us tick, like what's behind all of this? What does it all mean? When we look to these other cultures, we can go, oh, well, they're talking about it over there. If I
Mhm.
look at my own kind of white bread North American culture,
Mhm.
nobody's talking about soul or
Right.
even
Right.
I'd go to Sunday school because it was like, well, that maybe they're talking about it there.
Mhm.
Not really any deep discussions. It was basically kind of mythology class, you
Right.
know,
Yeah.
without any of the exegesis, just like here's the stories that are important to us.
Right. Right.
So yeah, so that just that curiosity and then looking out and finding a tradition that is dealing with some of these deeper questions of life, I guess.
And that a lot of these traditions are old,
Yeah.
and they're rich and deep. And being in America, and particularly on the West Coast in California, everything's so new,
Hmm.
right? And old houses from like the 1920s or 30s. Um, you go to Europe, there's bridges that are 600 years old.
Yeah.
And so being in a place that's the great frontier is the last place the settlers came to. It's the Wild West and everything's new and modern, and you don't have crumbled buildings just sitting here. Even the East Coast, I've seen abandoned mental institutions and old schools and warehouses just sitting there all dilapidated. We don't have that in California, at least where I live. So there's something about the old and the historical that goes back a long way. That for me is fascinating because I don't have that here. We don't have
Mm,
those um, old traditions, and same with stories, music, folk songs, you name it. I mean, there's
mm,
just a void, and at least in my life, of traditions. And holidays was just getting together, having some food, presents, toys. It was I didn't have any emotional connection to it. And then you look at these other cultures. I went to Japan a few times, and they've been doing some of the same rituals and family things for a long time. You could feel it. China, same thing. The qigong in the park, the music. It's just, and I think I part of me was missing that, and why the attraction to some of these old cultures, perhaps, is related to the historical, and that's part of depth psychology, isn't it? And
yeah.
the
I was
roots,
going to
and
say it's another facet of depth,
another facet of depth psychology of
time, tradition.
downward, inward, backwards
Hmm.
to gain richness now.
Hmm.
And also kind of helping you look forward too. Where are we headed? Well, let's check out what's happened before. Um,
Hmm.
so
And this kind of longing for something that we don't have in our culture, I mean, to me, that's another uh, indication or aspect, like soul kind of explains that.
mm,
Where is the longing in me for this thing that's I don't have in the here and now? Uh,
yeah,
how am I even aware of an absence? You know,
mm,
it's like, well, because the soul knows.
yes,
And when it finds something like a tradition, a lineage, and it's attracted to it, it feels that resonance, it feels that kind of fulfillment and satisfaction. I mean, that to me is all happening on the level of soul.
you make an interesting point about the gap, the lack, the lacuna, as a guiding post, maybe where the diamond sits. That
Mm,
out of that something that's missing, it can urge you on into something or get filled by something, perhaps. That maybe those gaps or longings are really important. I can't remember who said it. It's kind of famous quote of "Tell me what you long for, and I'll tell you who you are." Something of
yeah.
that
Yeah, I
nature.
mean, Hillman quoted that, and I think he said the German romantics.
Yeah, German
That's who he
romantics, right?
attributed to.
So yeah, something about that longing and
Yeah.
the gap um, seems important.
Yeah. Yeah, when I'm talking to people about kind of finding their path, finding their purpose, finding more meaning, that's what I always point to. And it's a kind of via negativa, I guess, in a way. Like
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
the thing that I'm feeling an absence of is pointing me in a direction. Like it's not like a voice announcing, go in this direction. But it's that
Hmm.
kind of strange paradoxical thing. The absence is the pointer or the urging forward or toward,
Yes.
something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
curious. I'm a question in my mind about Chinese medicine, depth psychology. We've already touched on some of the things that finding a practice like Chinese medicine can help fulfill in
Hmm.
like the soul's longing for
Hmm.
richness, depth, a kind of a well established like system. Uh, but in Chinese medicine, is there a place for soul? Do
Mm.
you talk about soul in Chinese
Hmm.
medicine? Is it addressed?
It is, and it's multiple.
Right.
So
Is
at
opposed
an S,
soul and there's
plurals.
different. Yeah,
There's
tell
different
me.
kinds of souls. Yeah. Um, and there's acupuncture point names with the word soul. There's herbal formulas that have point towards soul. And then there's spirit too, and they're differentiated.
Okay.
Um, and that's fascinating too. There's a textbook by Giovanni Macchioscia. It was his last book before he died. He was an Italian Chinese medical doctor, but he wrote a book called Chinese Medicine and the Psyche, and he did a wonderful job in really teasing out the different aspects of of soul and spirit in the tradition of Chinese medicine as it developed over a long period of time. So, for instance, there's what's called the ethereal soul or the hun, and that has to do with the soul that you might consider to be eternal. Like when you think about a soul that has multiple lifetimes or um, that can exist beyond the death of the body, that's referring to the hun. It resides in the liver. It requires a settling at night. So people that have insomnia sometimes is due to the hun not being able to settle, and that could be due to blood deficiency in the liver. So there's this idea of the coming and going of the hun, but that's the part of the soul that is immortal, let's say.
Hmm.
There's another part of the soul that's the po, or the corporeal soul, which is rooted in the body. It's everything in our human experience, our five senses, and it's said to die when the physical body dies. And that's connected to the lungs and breathing, comes in our first breath. And
Hmm.
so lung problems or asthma, sometimes related to the po, grief, sadness, sort of thing. So the hun and the po are the two main aspects of soul.
Hmm.
Um, they're all related to what's the Chinese called Shen, which is translated as mind, or better translated as spirit. And there's interrelationships between those three: the hun, the po, and the Shen. They all need each other and rely on each other. Um, but essentially, those are the three main ideas or concepts related to the soul in Chinese medicine. And they, of
Hmm.
course, have soul loss, soul deficiency, soul excess, soul um, problems that can occur at these different levels and affects, and it shows up in different symptoms and so forth. Um, so it's not a huge area that's emphasized in most Chinese medical schools, I think, at least in my experience, because I went to two different ones, two different medical schools, and we talk about a little bit, but it wasn't a huge part of the program. We're covering a lot of material in those years, but um, some teachers or some books that are a little more so-called esoteric or classical, you might get into that a little bit more, but it's not a huge area. Most acupuncturists aren't really thinking probably too much about the hun and the po. They're thinking more of qi and blood and the organs,
Hmm.
liver and spleen and kidney and um, that kind of stuff. But Shen is a big one. Shen, you see it right away. Somebody comes in, their eyes are dull or they're manic and they're kind of crazy looking. We say they have a Shen disturbance. Something's not right, on the mental emotional level. That's pretty ubiquitous in Chinese thinking and lingo and treatment, but the po and the hun not quite as much.
Now, okay. Is this more reflective of the Western culture that's appropriated the Chinese medicine? Yeah, because we
And
also, like one of Hillman's critiques of Western culture is that it's very spirit oriented. It's very comfortable talking about spirit, not so comfortable talking about soul anymore.
it's not just the West, it's also in China.
Well, which has been very westernized.
Westernized, yes. At least
Yeah,
in
but
Beijing and some of the hospitals. So yeah, we'll call it westernized as a values or industrialization and consumerism and that sort of, and thinking too, the ideas that go into that term. So yes, I think that's a big part of it. A lot of it also had to do with the culture revolution in the 50s in China.
mhm.
Anything spiritual, soul, anything related to qigong, subtle energy, anything esoteric was we're catching up to the world and science, and it's all
Let's get rid of all
physical.
that superstitious stuff.
Yeah, I'll get rid of all the superstition. It didn't go away though.
Oh
It
no, just went
went into
underground.
went into hiding, and
Mhm.
it's alive and well. But I think that's part of it when you get into standardizations of curriculum and school, um, you know, uh, texts and what's taught in both in China, particularly in Beijing, Shanghai, and also in the United States, tends to be more physical, materials based, and then more of the spirit if you're going to go in that realm, rather than the messy, sticky aspects of soul,
Mm,
which is a lot harder.
of Hun and Po.
Yeah.
Uh, well, one of the things I'm struck by is this Trinity, Hun, Po, Shen. Sounds a
Hmm.
lot like the Holy Trinity of, distant, omniscient Father, incarnate Son,
That's
and the
right.
Holy Spirit that connects all of it, right?
There's many other trinities in Chinese medicine. That's fascinating. Another very important one is Jing, Qi, and Shen. The idea that Jing is like our most fundamental substances, so our eggs and sperm and blood, the stuff that we're given at the beginning of our life. We have a limited amount of it. We lose it by not sleeping enough and expending our energy. That's the Jing. It's our it translates as essence. And then more subtle is Qi, energy, and then at the highest level is Shen or spirit. And a lot of the Taoist cultivation practices involves kind of like Kundalini in a way, transforming Jing to Qi to Shen, and another
Hmm,
trinity of denser to lighter substances. Um, and there's several other ones, but you bring up a good point. You see the archetype of the three, the Trinity, in a lot of areas, um, in herbal formulas, in acupuncture protocols, like 3 points, like on the sacrum, like making a lot of triangles and that kind of thing. So
hmm,
you do see the Trinity all throughout Chinese medicine.
hmm. That's fascinating. So it seems like with Hun and Po, these aspects of soul, I would say
Hmm.
is Po more like, would you say the what might be called in other cultures like the animal soul?
Hmm.
It's
Yep.
like really,
Yep.
so Hun is maybe there after, well, it's there before conception, but it's attracted to the embryo on
Hmm.
conception.
Hmm.
And so it's there before birth, but
Yes.
then it does the Po come in when we take that first breath? Is that
I
the
believe
idea?
so. I believe so, and maybe slightly before that. Depends on which text you read. But yeah, just before birth or right at birth, that's when the Po comes in.
The
Or
inhale, first inhale, Po
mhm.
enters, last exhale, Po leaves, but Hun
Yes,
will
yes,
continue on.
that's right.
And any idea where Hun goes after the body dies? Any
That
any
that
any myth about that or story about that?
oh sure. I wish I was a little more versed in that, Brian. Uh, Taoism and Confucianism has uh, a long history within themselves, and so depending on which school of Taoism, for instance, you'll probably get um, different ideas, but they tend to speak of things like heaven and the mandated heaven and the ancestors. So there's very much um, I would say a more of a polytheistic thinking of ghosts and ancestors and realms and animal spirits and deities in a lot of the old Taoist texts. Confucianism, not quite as much, although ancestor worship I think is still prevalent in that tradition. Um, but gosh, I wish I knew a little bit
Mhm,
more of that, more of the cosmo. What is it? The more the metaphysics,
mhm.
um, but not a whole lot.
Well, in Taoism, they might just say, well, it returns to the one or to heaven, which is again
R-
our translation.
right.
Maybe translation could be more like the sky realm, or because heaven has so much Christian connotation to it. It's hard to disassociate heaven
It
from the
is. It
Christian
is. I
idea
mean, the
of heaven.
Chinese have a character that's called Tian, Tian, which is more roughly translated as heaven. Um, but they often say returning to the Tao, returning to the source.
Mhm,
If you look in the I Ching, there's several hexagrams related to returning. So I think there is a sense of reincarnation, regeneration, returning to the original Tao, or at least that's a goal, perhaps,
mhm,
of some of those traditions.
mhm. I think it's clear how um, traditional Chinese medicine is deep and how, depth psychology differentiates from kind of mainstream psychology, which is
Hmm.
more surface level, behavioral, ego focused, all of
Yeah.
that stuff, right? But what about the interplay between them? So you've got degrees in both. Are they integrated in your practice with people?
Depends how you define integrated.
Yeah.
um,
Is the depth psychology, does it give you a different kind of maybe attitude as a Chinese medical practitioner?
it does. From the very beginning, in my first year of studying depth psychology, I already had an ear, let's say, towards dreams. Um,
Hmm.
and then later on, really paying attention to images, paying attention to gestures of my patients as they're telling me what's going on with them, paying attention to what's not being said, paying attention to projection and transference and countertransference, things that go on in the clinic, and also ways of meeting my patients. I think that from the beginning was already starting to be working on me, or I was able to start using them in some sense. It took me a lot of years to, and still am. If you want to use that word, integrate. It's 10 years
Yeah,
perhaps, because there's so much self work. Understanding the like shadow work, for instance, on myself and my family and friends, and then talking or working with that with my patients. And that takes a long time. And but from the beginning, I think the dreams, the images of the psyche, the imagination. So, for example, somebody comes in with bronchitis or a cough or something like that. After I get done asking the usual questions, I might ask them, "What does it look like on the inside of your chest?" Or is there an image? If you can visualize what it looks like, and they might say, "Oh, it feels like there's a tumbleweeds in my chest." Now we have an image to work with. And next time I say, "How's that tumbleweed?" "Oh, it's not a tumbleweed anymore. It's more like a sponge or something, and it's gotten more moisture in there." So it's just on an imagistic level, it's been really helpful. And then later on, getting more into like Hillman's political understanding that a lot of the frustration and irritability that I see with people um, is related to the world and related to our sick, ugly culture. And being able to talk about that kind of stuff in the clinic, it's not really medicine directly, but it's human stuff. And
it's
like
therapy.
it's therapy. And that's been really helpful. It really
Hmm.
opens the dialogue and what I can do with people, and just validating their difficulties. Um, and then Pacifica too, we got into really deep emotional stuff and we're crying all the time, and getting for me uh, more comfortable with more intense, strong emotions, being able to cry with my patients, talk about suicide, a lot of stuff I didn't get any training for in Chinese medicine. What do you do when somebody's having suicidal thoughts or you suspect they're thinking about them? Are you comfortable talking about that? And what do you do about it? And I've been able to meet people at those levels where I wouldn't have been able to before. So it's
Hmm.
brought a lot for me as a practitioner to meet people and open the space to areas that I just maybe were a little closed off to or didn't know about.
Yeah, yeah, right. Um, yeah, Hillman in particular on the topic of suicide, like asking or making the how might I say this? Uh, Giving credence to the impulse for suicide, like that
Yeah.
there's something meaningful about this impulse to suicide. It's not something to be cured away, but it's something to be followed, not literally,
Right.
but to find what part of the person wants to die or needs to die in order for, I don't know, Hillman hated the word
Mm-hmm.
growth or development, but
Mm-hmm.
I see that as what he was pointing to, even if he had this bias against talk of growth and development and
Right, right,
integration and
right,
all those terms.
right.
I don't
Watch
have the
your
same
language.
I know I don't have the same problem with those things, but I'm always he's always in the room, like when we're referencing him, and
Yeah,
I'm like, I know
yeah.
he's listening to me say like growth,
Ooh,
and he's like, yeah, you know what else
and
has
hope.
uncontrolled growth is cancer.
Right. And let's be
But
careful about hope.
yeah, yeah, definitely not hope. Um, but yeah, so that's one of the things I found in depth psychology too. It was approaching these topics in a much different way, um, that I don't know, allows for God, more depth of conversation, like to go
Yeah,
deeper into these
yeah,
things. That it's okay to talk about suicide. It's okay
yeah.
to talk about whatever kind of dark fantasy you might be
Mm-hmm.
having. Like, let's
Mm-hmm.
just get it out in the open, right?
Right.
And
And
that in
where
itself is
else
a
can
kind
you
of
do that?
healing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Where else can you do that?
Where else can you do that? During the pandemic, it was incredible. I'm sure you experienced it too. People were coming in so bottled up and stressed out. They were having arguments with their families. They could not speak their truth. They couldn't speak their mind safely.
Hmm.
Um, and I was just astonished how I just felt really bad. I didn't have anybody in their whole world, colleagues, family, friend, that they could just speak about whatever was bothering them or feeling or their opinions about stuff. And it was such a relief for for them and for me to just let it out. And
Yeah.
you
To
know,
talk about, uncertainty about vaccines and all the
yeah.
protocols and
I mean,
all of
hair
it. Yeah.
salons are pretty good for that, and maybe confession in the church. But even though there's a lot of judgment, and you have things were so tense and heated during the pandemic that people are walking on eggshells, and
Yeah.
just that just kills you. It kills the body, and that repressive like rubber band feeling just wound up, and um, yeah, that creating that open space for anything, whatever wants to show up, and um, when somebody can say something and in their mind they're like, how's this person going to respond, and are they going to think I'm crazy, or is this okay to say, and you're just like, mm-hmm, mm-hmm, and it's not a
Yeah.
big deal. They're just like, whoa. you know
Yeah.
like that doesn't
Or
bother you,
or
or
I'm with you,
I'm
I feel the same way. And
oh,
yeah. And if,
it's like, oh,
the
you think I'm
ugliness of
crazy,
the
like, no. Whatever.
I know. And there's also like here on the West Coast in Canada, which everyone wants to be really nice and everyone wants to
Yeah,
support the fantasy that we're living in paradise.
yeah,
And so there's a
yeah,
real, like for me, complaint is really in the shadow of this place. Like
that's right,
you're not allowed to complain about the way things are because hey, we're all in paradise, right? And
right, right.
and
It's
so
all
to have a
good, it's all good.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
or well,
Yeah, and it's
you
not.
could be living in Ontario or it's like no, but
Right,
there's things wrong here, okay? Can I not
right.
talk about it without feeling like Mr. Gloom and Doom over here?
Yes, complaining in the shadows of an ultra positive, um, just be positive thinking West Coast world, and
Yeah.
that casts a shadow.
Well,
Absolutely.
and it usually comes out as a kind of passive aggressiveness.
Yes, which is just so unpleasant
No.
and not helpful and not constructive at all.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Um, I think it's really great that so from depth psychology, you started to become more attuned to the images, dreams, and even the gestures that people bring into the clinical space.
Right.
Um, what about the way, like, because, yoga, Ayurveda, what they give me also is like a wealth of images to
Mm-hmm.
then
Mm-hmm.
to offer to people to help them make whatever's going on in their psyche a little more tangible and felt. It's
Yeah.
like why Jung and Hillman were attracted to alchemy because it offered this whole symbolic library of kind of material, tangible
Yeah.
images um, that could help people to uh, as Hillman said, make the soul matter, to
Mm-hmm.
help it become more concrete and
Mm-hmm.
felt and quote unquote real. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
now, they both had a problem with going to other cultures for these things, but what
Mm-hmm.
I found, not having that same kind of um, resistance or bias myself. What I find that's wonderful about both the Chinese and the Indian systems is that those symbols are attached to practices
Mm-hmm.
and tradition, like
Mm-hmm.
medical traditions using
Mm-hmm. That's right.
herbs and all kinds of other treatments.
They're anchored in a tradition.
Right. And that we can actually activate these images in a treatment of the symptoms to help lessen the symptomology.
Yes.
Now, I think that's wonderful and amazing. Alchemy does not give you that. I think people have taken like an alchemical approach to different things like ritual magic or whatever, but it's just not the same. It doesn't have that same depth and breadth.
No.
Uh, okay, so but this brings up another issue that Hillman might have a problem with, like the treating of symptoms rather than following the symptom and letting it be, and
Mm-hmm.
letting, maybe psyche find a resolution or a
Mm-hmm.
change or transformation.
Yeah.
Now, we're trying um, to treat symptoms, right? To find more
Mm-hmm.
harmony and balance in the system.
Right.
Do you find that Um, mm, does that go along with what you learned about in depth psychology school and especially the Hillmanian kind of style?
Yeah, it is. And there's a tension there. And it's very much Chinese thinking too. One of the first things what we're taught with diagnosis and treatment protocols is what they call root and branch. Uh, the root being the origin or the deepest part of the pathology or illness, and the branch being the symptoms, the superficial manifestations of it. And as a practitioner, are you going to treat the root or the branch or both? Or which comes first? Do you do the branch first and then the root, or vice versa? And that's a constant interplay for every clinician. The root and branch is a tension. And most acupuncturists, including myself, tend to treat the branches um, for a lot of reasons. But
Because it
the
gives like
root,
immediate relief would be one of the
yes,
reasons, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Like let's
People
do what we
come into you
can to
for
lessen suffering right here and now.
that's right. So somebody comes into you for neck pain. Um, they have other things going on in their bodies and in their lives, but they came to you. They're paying you. They want you to help them with your neck pain.
And
Okay,
it hurts right now.
and it hurts right now.
Yeah.
So um, most practitioners are going to go right to helping their neck pain, which, in my opinion, you should. And you can also at the same time inquire and start thinking about the root. And even in that first treatment, also be treating the branch. If you suspect that this is stress related, you can add acupuncture points that help with the Shen, the spirit, the mind, and other points to help with the stress, and then maybe even just bring into the conversation of what's going on in that person's life. Um, they never take a break for themselves. They're taking care of their elderly mother or whatever's going on with them. But even that, you're still probably on the root level. But it's a beginning of getting into it. I think
Or
to
branch
work
level, I
on
mean.
the root requires developing a relationship with your patient and seeing them over a long period of time. And I don't know if you ever even get to the root. I mean, you go towards it. I mean,
Mhm,
where is the root anyway? Where does the pathology begin?
mhm.
You'd have to go probably all the way back to birth or before, who knows? But the intention is
Yeah.
there. It's sort of like the law of perfection. No one ever attains it, but you move in that direction, whatever that means. But with the going towards the root of something, your intention is to go deeper and seeing if you can uncover deeper and deeper layers to it. And you can only go as far as you yourself as a practitioner are able to go. And then also, I think to a certain extent, where your patient is able to or where they're
Willing
comfortable.
to go. Yeah.
Some people just don't want to even go there. And you can't rip the band-aid off of them. You're not going to see them again. If you don't see them again, how are you going to help them?
Yeah, totally. Right.
Right. So it's a
Yeah.
fine line of when I was a younger practitioner, I was so keen on going to the root, like from the beginning.
Let's go
I was
deep.
so
Yeah.
I was all about the deep. I would do these 2 hour, 2.5 hour sessions with people,
Mhm.
like get I had so much energy and I was so interested in helping people. It's
The
like that
heroic
archetypal
archetype of
doctor with
youth
getting
too.
constellated and just like, I'm gonna help this person. I'm gonna throw everything at him and we're gonna get into it.
Yeah.
And I think that worked for a few people, but I think it overwhelmed and frightened some, and I probably lost patients that never came back
Yeah,
because
I
I was so
confess.
like,
I've
yeah, they're
also
like, this
fallen
guy's
into this.
a little too much. So that
Yeah.
comes with time and experience of meeting people where they are
Being
and
patient.
keeping in mind always those root and branch ideas. And from depth psychology, it's really the same thing. I mean, you ask most psychotherapists, people are coming in usually not for individuation necessarily, whatever that means, but for a problem, for a hiccup, for a snag in their life.
Mhm.
And you work on that, and then you start unpackaging or uncovering other things. But most people come in for they're having some kind of difficulty, and you
Mhm.
know you can approach it in so many different ways. But you the ability of the practitioner to meet the patient, and then again, it depends on the patient. I've had people that come in the very first session, boom, we're going into like
Mhm.
ancestor family stuff, like sexual trauma, all kinds of on the first or second session. Other
Mhm.
people I've worked with for years, we never even get close to that.
Mhm.
So, so it just depends.
Yeah. I'm curious, like how you practice. So if someone comes in, they're primarily coming in for acupuncture or herbal treatment. Is
Hmm.
that right?
And
And so,
body work.
okay, so you also do
I do a lot
some
of
kind of
massage.
massage. Okay. So the space for talking, for opening up these conversations, how does that happen? Is that something that people know that they can do with you? Do you make an invitation to them? How do you work that into the kind of hands-on practice?
As much as I'm able to from the very first phone call before I even meet them. That's why I like scheduling over the phone rather than email or text, but I can gain a lot of information just from a phone call. Um, but from the time I open the door for them and they come in, I sense kind of their energy and what they're coming in for. And some people are very short. They're like, yep, 2 days ago, like tweak my back, like I got to get back to work pretty soon. Like, could you just, help me out here? They
Wait,
and ask,
you're talking about men, right?
yes, but
Predominantly.
some women,
Yeah.
also very terse. They don't, and I've asked got a few questions. I'll ask a few questions, and they're very short. Yes, no,
Mm.
it's okay.
You can
Like,
tell they don't want to go there.
yeah, how's your sleep? How's your stress level? Fine, good,
They want to take
okay.
care of the branch,
Yep.
and that's
I'm
it.
like, okay.
Okay. Hmm.
And so, from that moment on, I'm like, all right, let's get you on the table and we'll start doing some work. And while they're on the table, I might go fishing a little bit,
Hmm.
ask a few more questions. And if still they're like eyes are closed, they don't want to talk, I'm not going to press it. And then at the end of the session, I might, give them some recommendations or follow up or something. And and that's it for those people. On the other side, someone comes in and they're just like, oh my gosh, so this is what's been happening. And they go
Hmm.
into a big story and da 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 da. And, I kind of have to rein them in a little bit. And
Yeah.
that's the other extreme that they want to tell me their whole life story and every ailment and scar they've ever had and
Hmm.
their whole health history. And that's great. And then I'm like, okay, we need to get you on the table. Let's do some work, or let's come up with a game plan for what we want to work on.
Hmm.
So it just depends on that initial treatment. I spend about an hour and a half with people in the first session because I don't like rushing because I want to find out why they're there, and
Yeah.
that can take a little time. Someone might come in and they spend 15, 20 minutes telling me all about this stuff. And then I'm like, okay, what's most important to you? What do you really want to work on? And they might say something completely unrelated to what they just told me.
Hmm.
Like, I said all this, but really, I really just, um, just need a massage. Like, I'm lacking touch.
Yeah. What did Hillman say? He said like once you find out the reason for the once you find out the reason the person came to therapy, the therapy's over. I mean,
Yeah.
there's
Or
something
it's just
to that.
beginning. I mean,
Yeah, I
you know,
know.
it,
It
it's,
sounds good though.
there's a, that's an interesting idea though. Like sometimes I'm wondering, like, what are these people doing here? Some people come in and there's nothing in particular. And
Hmm.
they're like, oh, well, my friend, said they heard good things about you and I just kind of wanted to try it. And,
Yeah.
um, or there's a pretext of like, yeah, it's kind of like just kind of some sore shoulders. And I'm like, okay, why are they really here? And that's interesting. And I am very cautious and I don't want to impose anything, but I also want to open the space up for something to come out of them of like, no, they're just maybe they haven't cried. They lost somebody and they're grieving and they need a place to cry. Or some people they don't get touched and they just need some,
Yeah.
massage and they need a pretext for getting
Yeah.
some body work. So there's
Even
all
if they
kinds of
haven't consciously sorted that out,
yeah,
right?
they don't
But
even
yeah,
necessarily consciously realize like what they're in there for.
they came
And
for
that's
intimacy or touch. Yeah.
and that's
Hmm.
where the depth psychology is really helpful of like what's not being
Yeah.
spoken or what's not seen overtly. And like,
Yeah.
okay,
Well, that's the
what's
shadow work, right?
right.
Yeah. Uh, okay. So if somebody comes in and they've got this kind of mm, really terse way of answering you when you're, trying to do a diagnosis or whatever, do you look at them through like a Chinese diagnostic system and go, well, there's a lot of dryness here, or there's constriction or constant, and so do you go in and maybe put in some pins to loosen things up, get things
Yeah.
flowing more? Like, do you ever do that kind of behind the scenes
Yeah.
treatment?
It's one of the blessings and a curse of having studied so much of different systems. I have like, let's say 5 or 10 different maps I'm
Hmm.
I'm working with. There's the 5 element system and um the wood, fire, earth, metal, water. I'm like, oh, this person is so metal.
Hmm.
And metals are very like cut and short and dry. And because of that, I know all kinds of characteristics that they might have. They tend to see the world in black and white. They are very concerned with rules and rights and justice. And um, they have a bigger space bubble and all kinds of characteristics of a metal constitution. So I'm thinking like constitution. And then when I'm treating, I'm like, okay, what's going to help their metal out? Maybe getting a little bit more fire or earth energy into them. Um, so
Soften the
there's
metal
a
a
five
little
element
bit.
map. Sometimes I switch into Ayurvedic. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a Vata out of balance here. Like
Mm-hmm.
they're super twitchy and jumpy and they need some settling down. So I'm gonna do some like calm Shen points. So I have these different maps that they
Yeah.
come in at different times. It's a little bit schizophrenic in a way because yeah, I'll get the depth psychology maps in there. I'm like, oh, this person's animus is like screaming at
Right. You
me.
start thinking archetypally. Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and even astrological. I mean, all
Hmm.
kinds of funny things come into my head. I don't have a rhyme or reason.
Yeah. I mean, I'm the same too. And it seems that something comes forward that is going to resonate with the person. And I trust that.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
but yeah, there are these different reference points, which to me just adds more richness to the kind of library of images that can arise in a session, right? So the more I study, the more I explore, the more I'm kind of a repository of this library of images, which then
Yeah.
I have to trust that if I blurt out, you know, I don't know, something about a metal dragon or something, that's good, person's gonna go, oh my God, I had a dream about a dragon last night.
That's
And
right. Yeah.
um
Right.
yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Uh, oh, something else was coming up for me when you were describing that situation. Um, it's gone, but I'm stuck with this image like metal. When you're talking about metal, I'm thinking sword.
Hmm.
Like the need for more space, the cut
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
dry,
Hmm.
maybe a kind of coldness or
Hmm.
rigidity. And
Hmm.
so when you're talking about bringing in fire, I'm thinking about softening that sword or
Hmm.
something like that. So do you also think like that way?
Hmm.
Yeah, so they're not just static kind of classifications, but
Hmm.
they're interactive, they're changeable, they're
Yep.
mutable.
Yep. Exactly.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's great. You're making me want to go to Chinese medical school. We've got a really good one here actually for acupuncture.
I heard
And
about that in your island. I believe there. there was
Paci-
two or three, but at
well,
least
Pacific Rim is really well known, and I think is one of
yeah,
the few that does whatever the certification here is.
that's right.
And I also, when I do my kind of depth psychology circles, I do them at a community acupuncture place that my friend runs.
Oh, wonderful.
Um, and it's the best place to do it because everyone's got like a lazy boy chair that they can lay back
Nice.
on,
Yeah.
um, and I love the kind of model of community acupuncture in terms of
Mm-hmm.
democratizing healing
Mm-hmm.
work.
Mm-hmm.
Mm,
Right.
mm.
Yeah, that's great.
So what about, did we get into the tension enough about like treating the symptom rather than simply following the symptom? Um, how do you deal with that? Like,
It's such a big topic. That could be a whole thing in itself. I Every practitioner is different. It it so much depends on what the person is coming in for, the severity of the illness. Um, I think that has a big part of it, and how much investment the patient has to the healing as well, um, which makes it challenging for the doctor that wants to go deeper into the branch. We our culture tends to want the quick fix, um, but it's an ongoing dance with
mm,
every clinician and patient, about how much you want to invest in your health. And uh, from a symptom standpoint, um, I used to think that that was not okay just to help somebody with their symptoms, but you might only see somebody one or two times, and you're a little stepping stone on their life path. And if
mhm,
that's all you get with them, that's all you get, and you got to make the most of it. And if I there's a lot of people I've only seen one time, but I'll get an email or call, or I'll run into them years later, and they're like, "Hey, you helped me that one time, boy. I
yeah,
walked out of there feeling better, and it never came back, and I never had to, and I never knew." Like,
mhm,
and maybe that wasn't going deep enough, but for them, it helped. And
mhm,
I think there's a lot of ways of helping people,
mhm,
and as much as it is great to go towards the root of something and go deeper, I've come to a place now where I don't know what's going to help somebody ultimately, and I just try to do the best I can with the time that I have with them, and I have to leave it at that. And so if I can go deeper, great. If I can't, at least help the branch. It's like a
mhm,
tree, it's like
yeah,
in the garden, you can pull the weeds out, which helps everything else. But if you can do some pruning and some composting and some uh you can help the tree out in other ways. It doesn't always have to be like building humus in the soil, although that's for the longevity, the best for the tree. Um
right,
so for me anyway, I've come to the point where I just say, you know what, I'm just going to help them best I can, and if that's just treating the symptoms, so be it. Um,
mhm,
and if I can go deeper with them, great. But
yeah,
that's each clinician's going to have to deal with that on their own.
yeah. Well, I think, like, Hillman would often talk about how modern medicine, modern psychiatry is really trying to cure away the symptoms. And if we cure away the symptoms, we don't ever get to what the symptoms have been trying to tell us, which is pointing more toward roots, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like something's going on behind the scenes that's causing a disturbance. The soul is trying to communicate to you through dreams
Mm-hmm.
and fantasies and
Mm-hmm.
symptomology about what's
Mm-hmm.
going on under in the levels that you can't see uh, immediately.
Yeah.
So the danger in treating symptoms is that we never get to hear their story.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
I think there's maybe a way to do both if it's the right kind of treatment, because much of psychiatric treatment is about numbing or anesthetizing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a sensitive Chinese medical practitioner or Ayurvedic specialist or yoga therapist or
Mm-hmm.
anyone who's offering some kind of practice or treatment to help alleviate symptom can use the practice itself to do that inquiry into what is this symptom telling us while we tamp down its
Yeah.
severity, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
don't
And
think Hillman ever saw that in action, so maybe he just didn't get that it could be a both and.
Yes, and when I reflecting on what I just said, I kind of phrased it as an either or, but in truth, I think even unconsciously, most practitioners are probably doing both at the same time, treating the root and the branch,
Hmm.
because that's how we were trained. You do constitutional, like look at their chi and blood, their organs, and you're doing both. And if you're creating an herbal formula, you're doing both too. So, um, yeah, certainly not an
Hmm.
either or. I think both can and maybe should be brought in on every treatment,
Hmm.
and they're not incompatible. I mean, they're not. It's not
Hmm.
a contradiction to do both.
Hmm.
They both have their values, and you can do them at the same time.
Hmm.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, it's a good point.
And you're bringing in a whole nother aspect of the kind of the psychological inquiry. So I'm imagining if you're giving someone a treatment, you might come along and go, "Hey, is anything coming up for you? Any kind of images or feelings?" So you just do a little like,
Mm-hmm,
what's happening inside there?
mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm.
And then you might have a different approach in dealing with that. If someone says, "Ooh, I'm getting this like this cactus feeling all over my body," you might have like a kind of a different path of inquiry into the
Mm-hmm.
cactus or what to do
Yeah,
with the cactus, uh, informed by your depth psychological training, right?
that's right.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think it's great. Well, this has been wonderful. I love talking to other practitioners who are looking at intersections of different modalities and
Mm-hmm.
ways of working, orientations, that kind of thing. It's really
Yeah.
fascinating, and I feel a lot of like resonance with you beyond just us sharing our first name. Uh, and I think, I'd love to talk to you more about some of the elemental, like how the the symbolic language of like Chinese medicine and Ayurveda and other systems like that, they are another way of working with archetypes
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that we don't really get from Jung and Hillman so much. I mean, they focus on alchemy and there's a lot of things there, but the kind of the systematized elemental
Right.
system. God, I said system twice, but you know what I mean, like how it's put together in a system and there's like practices
Right.
and all that. I think that's fascinating too, and for me, there's no contradiction there. But I'm noticing the time, and we have to talk about your book because that
Ah,
was the thing
yes.
that brought us together initially, and then I got really interested in all this other stuff that you do. So this book, bringing together the words of George Carlin and James Hillman,
Yes.
which I think is great. I love them both. I love their acerbic humor. I love their critique of society. I
Mm-hmm.
get a lot of catharsis from listening to them still. And I often find myself thinking, what would George or what would Jim think about what's going on in the world now? Like if they were this
Mm-hmm.
kind of despondent and pissed off about what's happening in the world back in the early 2000s or late 90s, what would they think now? Because,
Mm-hmm.
it's been 25 more years and things have just gotten worse.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what inspired you to put them together in this book?
It was, I don't know, inspiration's the right word. It was more of an obsession due to those guys' voices not leaving me alone.
Okay.
They were bugging me. They
Compulsion,
just,
maybe, not
they were,
inspiration.
yeah. They, I had to write it down. I was kind of going crazy because I kept hearing them clamoring, and their voices would mingle and argue with each other, and it was kind of driving me nuts. So I I just started writing quotes down related to words and language once I realized that that was the theme that was dominant, was their views on words and language. And I just started writing everything that was coming to me from their books and lectures and performances, and that was the beginning of it. And it just continued and continued to a point where I realized that I had a project now, and they were kind of urging me on to complete it. And so I dug deeper and figured out how I was going to turn this into something, and just kept working on it, and took took about 2 years, and then the fun stuff of editing and finding a publisher. Took about all in total about 6 years.
Hmm.
Um, so now those those guys' voices are quiet to a certain extent. So really, it was them. They were bugging me.
You've laid the ghosts to rest by hearing them and following that.
Yeah, they still had a lot to say. I think that
Yeah.
was it. They just had a lot to say, and I needed to put them together. They needed to be. I felt like those guys needed to have a conversation together,
Yeah.
and that's why I did Hillman Carlin juxtaposed to each other, so their voices
Hmm.
could
They're
kind
in
of clamor
dialogue.
back and forth, because that's what it felt like. They wanted to go at it together, and they had
Hmm.
a beef to pick with words and language, and
Yeah.
so
Did when you were at Pacifica, were you there when Hillman was still alive? No, you missed him?
he died in October of 2011. I started in October of 2012.
Mm. Mm.
It's odd. I feel like I met him, but I've never met him. No, I
Well, I'm
missed
sure
him a
his
year.
his spirit was in that place, right?
Oh,
Like,
all over.
hmm.
Yeah, all over the place. And I got to be friends with Pat Barry in Carpinteria,
Oh yeah.
and now
For people listening, Pat Barry is one of Hillman's wives.
yeah, sorry, second
And
wife,
I'm thinking amazing depth psychologist in
co-founder of
her own right.
archetypal psychology, although she doesn't like to speak of it in that way. But she was there from the beginning of archetypal psychology and still going strong. Just published a book herself. Um, and I also got in contact with Margot McLean, Hillman's third wife, through my book in spring. So that's been a
Hmm.
nice um, connection too. So even though I never got to meet Hillman, I felt like I have.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I have that feeling too, and I think it's there's like you know how Hillman talked about you gotta find out like who's on your tree.
Yeah, yeah,
Right? Like as you start to
yeah,
build your worldview,
yeah.
and like a way to like kind of focus your reading and things like that, like
Hmm.
you got to figure out. So if you're into Hillman, you gotta read Young because then he's on Hillman's tree and that kind
That's
of
right.
thing, right?
Yep.
But like Hillman's definitely on my tree. Like he speaks my language.
Hmm.
I like his fire, his
Hmm.
piss and vinegar.
Hmm. Hmm.
And also like he's been a great kind of curator of ideas. Like he points me toward people that he references,
Hmm.
and that helps to feed maybe the root system of my own
Hmm.
tree. You know, like
Hmm.
where did he get his ideas? And it's
Yes.
art, it's literature,
Yes.
it's the classical thinkers, all of that kind of is
Yes.
feeding this tree that I happen to be on.
That's right. Yeah, same
Um,
here.
so did you get to did you get access to the Hillman archives at Pacifica in looking for source material?
Hmm.
Oh,
Yep.
that's a dream of mine, you know.
Hmm.
I
I
have this
still go to the
fantasy.
campus. Checked out some DVDs last week.
Oh,
Yeah, I
amazing.
take advantage of being close to the school.
Wow. I have a
So
fantasy of getting a job at Pacifica to help them with their archive and maybe get some of it online or something just so I could have access.
it's good fantasy. They could probably use the help.
Maybe I'll talk to some people. But one of the things that I'm curious about, first thing I would do if I ever got access to the archives is try to find the recording of when Hillman was on Oprah, because it's something that
I've been looking
I've
for that.
never
I
been able
can't
to
find it.
see. It's listed in the archives, and I talked to Steve Eisenstadt about trying to dig it out,
Hmm.
um, but it hasn't surfaced yet, and I need to see that.
Okay, next time I go back there, I'll see if I'll dig that up and
Please.
record it and send it. Yeah, I want to see that too. That's got to be funny.
Oh, yeah.
He's so out of place. He's so uncomfortable about that whole thing. He did not like that, and he wasn't received well. He just this is Hillman on Oprah. He just like nah. But that's why it's so funny because I want to see that.
I know, and I'm sure that's why it's never surfaced. It's because, like you can find Tom Moore speaking with Oprah, but Tom is just such a kind of jovial, generous, like kind of soft-hearted
Soft
dude.
pillow.
Oh yeah, he's like the
Hey.
well, he's the yin to Hillman's yang. You know,
Yeah.
they're soul brothers, but they occupy very kind of different
Different personalities completely.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I've you can see Tom Moore on Oprah, and Oprah puts that up on her site, and isn't this wonderful? We're talking about soul with Tom Moore, but this conversation with Hillman must have been just yeah.
And there was also a conversation that he did with Deepak Chopra.
No.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I haven't seen that either, but I read some stuff that Hillman said about that whole gathering. All I remember is Hillman was like, I was bloody bored as hell. He's like, that whole, they didn't, they were very, Hillman didn't like him. And he was bored with the whole talk. It bored the crap out of him. Um,
Yeah, no doubt.
but I want to find that one too.
Oh, please. Oh, that's fantastic. And then, one of the things about Hillman and Carlin, yeah, it's nice to see them in dialogue with each other because you could see how they shared a lot of same kind of views on the way society has gone,
Yeah.
and they both had like a facility with words. They loved wordplay. Um,
Hmm.
One of the things that strikes me though is both of them really had a kind of bleak outlook on the state of humanity and where we're
Hmm.
headed. And
Hmm.
that's where you got the title of the book. Like
Hmm.
one of the last things that Carlin was talking about, the analogy he was using is that our humanity is circling the drain and we're going in tighter and tighter circles. Like we're just about done.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Hillman often relied on this analogy. He'd say, like, we're on the Titanic, the ship is
Hmm.
going down. What do
Hmm.
we do? Like, that's
Hmm.
the big question. What do we do? Do we look for a
Hmm.
lifeboat? Do we try to
Yeah.
like pump out the water from, what do we
Yeah.
do? And I think they had kind of different responses to that. Like in seeing that's where things were going from their point of view, and I would agree. Um, they had a different approach to it, I think, right? Like, can you
The
talk a little bit
interesting,
about that? Yeah.
the interesting thing about all that, I've been thinking about a lot of that the last few years. Like they weren't they weren't nihilists and they weren't actually pessimistic either, even though Hillman calls himself a catastrophist and Carlin's talking about circling the drain. They wouldn't have done what they did, I think. Continue writing books, continue doing stand-up, new material, interviews. They wouldn't have continued doing what they're doing if they didn't give a crap.
Hmm.
Like
Right.
somebody who's just thrown up their hands and said, forget it. You don't continue working at that ferocious pace. And they quite on the contrary, they cared a lot about humanity, and I think they loved the world very much, and they were probably in that mindset of things aren't getting better, but you still love the world anyway, and they continue doing what they're doing because they gave a crap.
Hmm.
And even though Carlin said, sometimes not giving a shit is really helpful, but he did give a shit. And um, when the World Trade Center came down, the day before that happened, he was doing a live show called the title of it was going to be "I Love It When a Lot of People Die" or something like that. And they changed the
Right.
title of it, but he was, according to his daughter, he was very upset and devastated by the World Trade Center and everything that happened. I mean, the stuff that happened in the world deeply affected them, and um, they did care very much. And so even though they had these images of we're circling the drain, the ship's going down, they continued working, and that tells me they did actually care. They didn't necessarily have hope, but like they kept working at it.
Hmm.
And so if kind of an answer to Hillman's question, what do you do when the ship's going down? Well, in these guys' case, you keep at it. You keep doing the craft. Whatever it is your thing is, you keep doing it. I'll keep seeing patients till I can't see them anymore, or whatever that is for me. And um, that I think for them, they despite those images, they did actually care. And so that's a kind of interesting paradox that I kind of come to. It wasn't a
Yeah.
nihilistic thing.
Yeah. Well, Carlin, also like he said that like I root for the asteroid, the big
Yes.
asteroid to hit the
Yeah.
Earth. Like he's like actively rooting for it. It's like it's time for another species to get a chance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah, that
you're
we didn't
right.
deserve, we didn't deserve, to be, yeah, we've messed it up so bad that we don't deserve it. And
Yeah. But
yeah,
you're
that's
right though.
the descent of,
If he had such a great disdain for humanity, he wouldn't have kept commenting. He wouldn't have been out there publicly. And
that's what
so,
I think. That's what I think too. Yeah,
yeah.
that's what I think too.
And I think like both of them, like Hillman used to call after he quit his clinical practice, he said, "Now I'm doing a therapy of ideas,
Mm-hmm,
and I'm putting psychotherapy through a therapeutic process and
mm-hmm,
analysis, right?" And
mm-hmm,
I think that's what Carlin was doing too. Like
mm-hmm,
both of them were not afraid to reflect the dark side
mm-hmm.
and to speak out what was wrong with
That's right.
humanity, with society, in our approach to. I mean, they covered both, just about everything, both of them,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
and so that kind of role is much needed, and it's a kind of a dangerous role to put yourself in because you open
mm-hmm,
yourself up to then a lot of well, critique and anger and
mm-hmm.
dismissal and they both saw all of that, right, throughout their
That's right.
careers,
Right.
and yet
They
persisted.
they had a great ability to not, as Carlin said, not give a shit. Hillman didn't care what people thought about him, really, and neither did
Not give a
Carlin. They
shit
just
about
kept
what
doing.
other people think about you, but to give a shit about the state of the world.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. And that's a rare combination, especially in our age of censorship. And you wonder why there's not more people like Carlin, comedians speaking out at that level of that edge.
And that's
To
kind
really
of depth, like
and
there's a
that
lot of
depth.
people who do commentary,
Hmm.
but with that level of wordplay that shows that like in the roots of our language is as affects a lot of our assumptions about who we are and what our place in the world is, right? Like he went like Hillman also was an etymologist and went down to the roots of language to discover like what shapes our mind, this peculiar Western way of seeing the world that's so fucked up and has done so much
Hmm.
damage. It's like it's there in the language. So let's do a therapy on the language.
Really, I consider Carlin to be a depth psychologist. He didn't know it, but he his way of thinking is or was a depth psychologist. He peeled layers off. He looked underneath things. He examined the surface, and he had that intelligence and depth to see through, which is such a important part of archetypal or
Mhm.
depth psychology. And um, he had that rare combination of talent, of hard work, and intelligence with that gift of putting it all together and performing it. And
Yeah.
that's a rare
And heart
combination.
too,
And heart.
because you're not gonna listen to guys like that for too long unless you feel the love that's behind all of the kind of sardonic
That's
humor,
right.
right?
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
And like something about their way of like their methodology, like a deconstructing, ripping
Hmm.
apart.
Hmm.
All of this like gives me images of like, well, to see through, but also to kind of get down to the roots. Like you got to do that ripping apart, tearing down, all these deconstructionist images, right?
But by the way, I suspect that both those guys were metal elements.
It's so a lot
So,
of sword
yep.
hacking away. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, have you ever done that? Like looked at I don't know how you do it in Chinese medicine. Like do you look at their year of birth and time of birth or anything like that to get a sense of their
No,
constitution, or is it like you have to be with them to
no,
or
no, no.
listen?
You can look at their face, their hands, their voice, their body posture, their movements. No, it's you could just look. You could look at somebody. Um,
Hmm,
Hands are great. The giveaway, shape of the face. So and just style of speaking. It's in the voice. Um,
hmm.
Earth elements have a sing-songy voice, and da, 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 da.
They
Woods
both
are
have
kind of
that.
punch. Woods are kind of punchy, like little in your face. Waters like mine is kind of groaning, flowy voice, so forth. So you can tell pretty easily if you know what to look for.
Hmm. I was actually gonna ask you, I had here in my notes to ask you about their kind of like from a Chinese medicine point of view, like what something about their constitution that informs the way they presented themselves or their method of work. And so metal,
Yeah, metal.
incisive,
Mm-hmm.
could be kind of cold and
Mm-hmm.
standoffish, I
Mm-hmm.
guess.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Mhm.
What else?
Prodding, poking.
Prodding, poking. There's also an element of metals are constantly dealing with the question, what's the point? For what? Like, what's the meaning? They're
Mm.
very much concerned with that question as a life, whereas wood is, what's next? What do I do? That's wood. Um, and Whereas when water, for example, is related to death and fear and are thinking of ultimate questions. What's it all come
Yeah,
to? Water and
I was thinking water, why?
why? Yeah. Metal and water are similar, but
Mm.
those guys, yeah, that they did have that kind of um, depth of existential, like what is this? That's very metal, and metals struggle in our world. It's a tough constitution to be. I know in a lot of metals, and it's why? What's the point? What what is going on here?
Don't
And
ask
perhaps that's where
why, just do is maybe our culture, right?
yeah, our culture is wood. American is if you're gonna generalize, it's a wood element. At least its origins and values have been wood. Pioneers, forging ahead, do, go, go. That's all wood. Competitiveness. Um, and But metals are more of an inward, contractive, introspective. What's the point? And are very again concerned with rules and rights and justice. You can't do that. That's not right. That's not, you can't do that. That's metal. Little kids like, no, 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 like you can't do that. That's not the rule.
Mm.
That's do the rule, follow. You know, Carlin and Hillman, of course, were very rebellious, but they had a sense of justice. I think
Yeah,
justice,
justice beyond societal rules and norms.
yes,
Yeah,
like justice on a big ethical level, and
yeah,
they're wrestling with those ideas all the time.
yeah. And like Hillman often spoke up for the value of the empty protest. So you
Hmm.
don't even have to have a why something is
Hmm.
wrong, but just to cry out like it's just wrong what we're doing to the world. And
That's metal.
you don't even have to like get into why, but yeah, just to point out that
That's
something is
metal.
wrong. There's a great
Yeah,
injustice here. Don't ask me why. It's just wrong. If you can't see that, there's something wrong with you.
that's right. That's metal. That's metal right
Huh,
there. Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Now, kind of conversely, maybe, but from the other side, like, is there a place for humor in Chinese medicine? Like, is humor a part of a diagnosis and treatment? Like, if someone comes and they haven't laughed in a year, uh, could I recommend that they go see a funny movie or, is like humor play a part in the treatment?
Does it does with me.
Yeah.
Um, it wasn't an area that was covered at all in our training program, and I don't see it in any of the textbooks, um, modern or classical. um, but it's a very human thing, and
Mhm.
for me, it's vital. I mean, humor is very tricky, but I always try to bring in some kind of humor into my sessions because if you can't laugh at the tragedies of life and laugh through some of the difficulties, you're in trouble. And I mean, sometimes you just when things are so heavy and deep, like if you don't have humor, it's a tough go. So um,
Mm.
if done with tact and subtlety, um, I think it's almost imperative that a practitioner bring in humor every time. I mean, I have a serious side, but I mean, I wrote a book on Carlin, so I love humor, but
But the
to me,
therapeutic
it's so
value of humor,
it's such a
right?
given, at least for me. I
Mm.
gosh, I don't know what I would do without it. And thanks for bringing that up. And it's not talked about in medical school. It's a human thing that should just be there along with compassion. I mean, it should be side by side with that, as
Yeah.
far as I'm concerned.
Uh, Maybe because like in Chinese culture with its roots in Taoism, like Taoism, Lao Tzu was so funny. Like as of now, I'm getting into my 50s, I'm becoming more of a Taoist.
Hmm.
I'm just kind of loving it. And reading about how Lou Reed, this really sardonic, caustic kind of person, got into Tai Chi in a
Hmm.
really big way. Um, and it's kind of getting me interested about Tai Chi too, because like Lou Reed was kind of a badass, um, and then reading Dao De Ching for the first time and like finding so much humor in it, so much kind of practical, down to earth wisdom
Hmm.
without really like, I don't know, no kind of hierarchies of deities and metaphysics and all of this. It's like it seems so kind of down to earth to me, and there's a humor in it. And I wonder if all that to say, like, I wonder if the humor is just a part of the way of life, and so we don't have to explicitly talk about it as part of the treatment or the in the interaction between the patient and
From the
doctor.
Chinese theory, I think it's related to the heart organ and the fire element, and which is related to joy and somebody that has a lack of humor or lack of joy, you think of a deficiency in the heart or um, something related to that. And I would, I mean, gosh, you bring up such a good point. I think that um, you could reduce it to the individual, like, well, people have different senses of humor. Some people are really funny or not funny, and some people are really serious or not serious. But um, if there's a complete lack of humor, there's something missing. Going back to the lacuna, the gap there, and that's noteworthy. And I would say that's related to the heart. And
Mm. Loss of
so yeah,
Poe.
there's been times where I've tried making jokes or tried doing funny, and the person just is not. They're not laughing, and I'm thinking, gosh, there's some depression here, or some shen or heart something's is
Mm.
there, or I'm just not getting their sense of humor.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I
from
would say that's a vital part of life. And gosh, if you can't bring in some humor at some point, you're in trouble.
yeah. What the way I think about it, or I've come to think about it, is if you're able to laugh at your predicament, you've become disidentified with
Mhm.
the suffering. So
The
like
space.
humor requires some distance, right? To be able to laugh at something, you got to be kind of outside of it and to see it maybe in a new light.
That's
So I
right.
always say to people, if we end up like laughing together after they've just told me about some terrible thing that's going on in their life, I go, look, that's a sign of health, actually.
Yes,
It's
I
not a
agree.
defense against
Yes,
pain. It's a
yes,
sign of health that we've created a little bit of distance here. We can see from outside of it. And like even from a yogic perspective, I think that's a sign of progress in separating
I agree with that. Very
identity
good.
with, yeah.
Well said.
Mm. So yeah, for me too, it's got to be there.
Mm.
And I think it has to do with my constitution and being raised by people like Carlin and
Yeah.
Eddie Murphy and others. Like, I would often lament, well, I didn't grow up with any kind of spiritual books in my house or any literature or anything, but we had great rock and roll records, and my parents were always playing comedy records.
Hmm.
So I grew up with these guys, probably hearing them like much too early,
Yeah.
but it kind of cultivated it cultivated my funny bone. I don't
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
which I'm really thankful for because it's I think it's helped keep me healthy.
Me too, for sure. For sure.
One of the other things I think about too, like you talked about like the heart and the liver, but for me, when we laugh, the diaphragm it leaps, the
Hmm.
diaphragm is just
Hmm.
moving. And the other times when the diaphragm is so kind of active is when we're sobbing or we're
Hmm.
coming, we're orgasming.
Hmm.
Um, And so if the
Yeah.
diaphragm is
The lungs.
frozen, we're not going to cry, we're not going to laugh, we're probably not going
That's
to
right.
feel a lot of sexual pleasure.
That's right.
Everything's kind of locked up. So I think whatever we can do to get the diaphragm moving again, mobile,
Yes.
is going to help everything kind of move because it's the barrier between like the gut and the heart in a way, right? It's what's in
You got it.
between.
Yep.
Yeah. So
Yep.
did they talk about diaphragm in Chinese medicine?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. It's an important zone. Some important channels go through there and some acupuncture points. Um, when you do qigong and tai chi, breathing is a fundamental component of those exercises, and diaphragmatic breathing and belly breathing. So it is it's in there. I wouldn't say it's emphasized, but it's there.
Hmm. Yeah. So it's another place where, I come to this question like one of the people I grew up with too, one of my first teachers or gurus was Frank Zappa, who
Mm,
also shared a similar kind of sardonic, caustic, critical humor um, as the other guys were talking about. But he was once famously asked a question by a reporter because he wrote a lot of like funny songs, but he was also kind of a serious and accomplished composer. And so they would ask him, does humor belong in music, Mr. Zappa? And he said, well, is it possible to laugh while having sex? And I guess that's up for you to answer, but it'll reveal a lot about about who you are and how seriously you take yourself, right?
well said. Well said.
So
I
like
like
the
that.
question in my mind during, as we're talking about these guys and about your work and is like, does humor belong in psychotherapy? And I think the answer is kind of the same.
Yeah.
Like, does it belong in life? You know?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Because that's what psychotherapy is hopefully dealing with the entirety of life.
Yeah. And like everything, it has its time and place, and it's not appropriate in every situation. But if it's lacking, you're missing something.
Mm. Well, I've had a lot of fun talking to you.
Likewise,
This has
man.
been great. Now, I noticed that you've got some plans to do more writing on this intersection of Chinese medicine and depth psychology. Are
Yeah.
you working on a book or you doing articles or what's going on with that?
At the moment, no, I'm letting the ideas germinate and enjoying those two guys off my shoulder for a minute.
Yeah, good. Okay. But because it's not something I've heard explored enough or at all even. And so I want to hear more. And I'd love that you're bringing them together. I think we need more hands-on, embodied, physical, tangible practices to bring the depth psychology to life. It's something that I'm
Mhm,
involved in,
mhm.
and I love meeting another person who's involved in that too. I think it's
Yeah.
like the next step
Mm,
for depth psychology,
mhm,
is like bringing
mhm.
it into the world, into the body,
Yeah.
and actually having a treatment that can help with symptoms without curing them away, but the
Mhm,
the treatment itself is helping us to go deeper into what the symptom
mhm,
is
mhm,
leading us
mhm.
toward, that root system approach. Yeah, I
Well
think it's
said.
great. So
Thank
I
you.
just want to encourage you to, when the time's right, start putting out some stuff, and
Sure.
hopefully this conversation will kind of ignite and inspire some other people too to start
That's the
talking
idea.
about it more, thinking about it more. Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
Great. Well, um, I'm sure we'll be in touch down the road. You got to follow up with me about the archives. If you find that conversation with Oprah and Hillman, we got to
Sure.
have a watch party or something. I'm
Yeah.
sure we'll get a lot of laughs out of it.
Will do.
Thanks a lot, Brian. Take care.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Brian.